What happens when a television host mistakes Southern charm for weakness and launches an unprovoked attack on a guest who's been waiting decades for exactly this moment? What you're about to witness isn't just another political debate gone wrong. This is the unforgettable story of how Joy Behar tried to humiliate Senator John Kennedy on live television and instead found herself systematically dismantled by a man who turned every insult into a weapon, every attack into an opportunity, and every moment of arrogance into a masterclass on the difference between talking loud and speaking truth. This is the interview that broke the internet. This is the confrontation where confidence met preparation and lost spectacularly. This is the moment when millions of viewers watched a seasoned politician take a talk show host to school without raising his voice, without losing his composure, without breaking a single drop of sweat. And this is the day Joy Behar learned that some guests don't come to play nice, they come to win. The View studio carried its typical pre-show electricity that morning. Audience members filed into their seats with the excited chatter of people who'd scored tickets to one of daytime television's most watched programs. Stage managers moved through their practiced choreography, ensuring lighting was perfect, audio levels were balanced, cameras were positioned precisely. Everything hummed with the well-oiled efficiency of a show that had done this thousands of times before. But there was something different in the air that particular morning. Something that the production staff couldn't quite identify but definitely sensed. Joy Behar sat at the panel reviewing her notes with unusual intensity, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth that suggested she had something special planned. Those who knew her well, who had worked alongside her through countless interviews, recognized that expression. It was the look of someone who believed they were about to score a major victory on national television. Senator John Kennedy was scheduled as the day's featured guest, and Joy had made no secret of her intentions. In the green room before the show, she'd been heard making comments about how she planned to expose the senator's tactics, how she was going to call out his approach, how the audience was going to see through his folksy act. She'd spent the morning preparing what she clearly believed were devastating questions, loading up her rhetorical ammunition, getting ready to take down a political figure she'd long viewed as nothing more than a performance artist hiding behind a southern drawl. What Joy Behar didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that Senator John Kennedy had spent his entire career facing down opponents who underestimated him. Lawyers who thought his accent meant he was slow. Politicians who believed his humor indicated lack of substance. Media personalities who assumed his calm demeanor signaled weakness. And every single one of them had learned the same hard lesson that Joy was about to receive. John Kennedy's greatest weapon wasn't his voice or his charm. It was his absolute mastery of language combined with an unshakable confidence born from decades of never being proven wrong. The audience settled into their seats, programs in hand, ready for what they assumed would be typical View fare, some political sparring, maybe a few awkward moments, hopefully some entertaining television. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would dominate social media for weeks, that would be analyzed and replayed millions of times, that would become a defining moment in talk show history. Behind the scenes, producers ran through final checks. Everything was ready. The set looked perfect. The cameras were positioned flawlessly. The audience was primed. All that remained was bringing out the guest and letting Joy work her magic, or so they thought. What nobody in that studio understood yet was that they weren't about to witness an interview. They were about to watch an execution, carried out with surgical precision by a man who'd been underestimated one too many times and had finally decided to teach an unforgettable lesson about the cost of arrogance. The show's opening theme music faded, and Joy Behar turned toward the camera with that practiced television smile, the one that had launched 1,000 segments. But there was something extra in it today, a hint of anticipation, a glimmer of satisfaction for what she believed was coming. "Our next guest," she began, her voice carrying that syrupy sweetness that barely concealed the knife underneath, "is a man who has somehow convinced people that making headlines is the same thing as making a difference. A politician who mistakes clever soundbites for actual governance." The audience responded with rehearsed laughter, but there was an edge to it, an uncomfortable quality that suggested even they could sense this introduction had crossed some line from playful to personal. Joy's eyes gleamed as she glanced toward the stage entrance. "Please welcome Senator John Kennedy." The senator entered the studio with deliberate, unhurried steps. Not slow, there was nothing uncertain about his movement, but measured, purposeful, controlled. His expression was calm, almost serene, the face of someone completely at peace with whatever was about to unfold. He acknowledged the audience with a single nod, offered another to the panel, then settled into the guest chair beside Joy with the ease of someone who'd sat in far more uncomfortable seats than this. He didn't smile in that desperate, please like me way that so many guests adopt. He didn't need to. The quiet confidence radiating from him, the absolute certainty in his eyes, it communicated everything that needed to be said without a single word being spoken. Joy crossed her legs with theatrical precision, papers arranged in her hands like weapons she was preparing to deploy. She leaned forward just enough to appear casual, while maintaining that predatory edge. "So, Senator," she started, her tone dripping with false sweetness covering barely concealed contempt. "Tell me something. Do you believe your constant attempts at humor are actually covering up a fundamental lack of depth? Or is the folksy routine just calculated misdirection?" The studio went quiet. The audience murmured uncomfortably, half amused by the boldness, half shocked by the immediate hostility. This wasn't an interview question. This was an attack disguised as curiosity. Kennedy didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't show even the slightest sign of discomfort. When he spoke, his Louisiana drawl wrapped around each word like velvet over steel, soft in delivery but carrying unmistakable strength. "Well now, Miss Behar," he said, his voice measured and calm, "if depth means drowning yourself in nonsense just to sound intellectual, then I suppose I'll happily stay in the shallow end. At least there I can still see the bottom and the truth." The laughter that erupted wasn't the polite, prompted response Joy had been expecting. This was genuine reaction, spontaneous and real, the sound of an audience recognizing they'd just witnessed something unexpected. Joy's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, barely long enough to notice, but the cameras caught it, that micro-expression of surprise before she forced her face back into its practiced mask. She hadn't expected that. She'd anticipated defensiveness, maybe some stumbling justification, perhaps an attempt to deflect with humor. What she got instead was a man who'd taken her attack and casually redirected it back at her with surgical precision. Joy tried to recover, glancing down at her notes as if consulting them. But Kennedy's calm silence filled the studio more effectively than any words could have. The power dynamic she'd expected to control was already shifting, and everyone in the room could feel it. "Well," Joy said with a tight chuckle, her eyes narrowing slightly, "you certainly have an answer for everything, don't you? I suppose that works better when nobody's bothering to fact-check what you're saying." Kennedy leaned back slightly, the picture of complete ease, as if he were discussing the weather rather than fielding barely veiled insults on national television. "Oh, I'm absolutely certain people will fact-check every word I say today," he replied smoothly. "The trick, Miss Behar, is saying things that are true enough to survive that scrutiny. You might want to consider trying it sometime." The audience reacted again, stronger this time. Some applauded outright. Others simply watched with widening eyes, sensing they were witnessing something bigger brewing, some confrontation that was building toward an inevitable explosion. Joy looked toward the camera, her smile widening but not reaching her eyes, a mask stretched over mounting frustration. "Well," she said, her voice carrying forced lightness, "this is going to be interesting." Kennedy's response came low and smooth, cutting through her false cheerfulness like a blade through silk. "That depends entirely, ma'am, on your definition of interesting. Are we talking interesting for the pursuit of truth? Or just interesting for your ratings?" The laughter that followed wasn't something Joy could control or direct. It rolled through the studio organically, authentically, the sound of people genuinely amused by what they were witnessing. The battle had officially begun, and the first blood had been drawn, but not from the guest Joy had intended to wound. Joy leaned forward, her patience visibly thinning with each passing second. The polite facade she'd maintained at the opening had begun cracking, revealing something sharper underneath, something colder and more aggressive. "You mock your colleagues," she said, her tone clipped and precise, each word deployed like a small explosion. "You transform serious policy discussions into punchlines. You turn people's genuine pain into opportunities for your little comedy routine. Is that what you consider leadership? Or is it just intellectual laziness dressed up in Southern charm?" The studio fell into that particular kind of silence, where every small sound becomes magnified, someone's bracelet jingling, a phone vibrating in someone's purse, the subtle hum of the air conditioning system. Every person in that audience leaned forward slightly, unconsciously, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Kennedy looked at her without irritation, without defensiveness, without any of the reactions she'd been trying to provoke. He simply gazed at her with that same unshakable calm, like a man who'd seen this exact attack pattern 100 times before and had long ago mastered the perfect counter. He took a slow, measured breath, leaned slightly toward his microphone, and spoke with devastating evenness. "Miss Behar, if the truth causes pain when it's spoken plainly, perhaps the problem isn't the joke. Perhaps the problem is that your comfort has become more fragile than reality." The words landed like a silk-wrapped hammer. The audience reacted instantly, half gasping at the boldness, half applauding the precision of the response. Even one of the other co-hosts shifted awkwardly in her seat, clearly trying to suppress a smile. Joy blinked hard, her jaw visibly tightening. "Oh, that's cute," she said quickly, forcing out a laugh that sounded more desperate than amused. "Did you practice that one in your bathroom mirror this morning?" Kennedy tilted his head slightly, a small smile ghosting across his lips. Not smug, not arrogant, just quietly confident. "No, ma'am," he replied calmly. "You invited me here expecting a circus. I'm simply sorry that I brought a mirror instead of performing tricks." The crowd exploded. Laughter, cheers, a few scattered boos from those still loyal to Joy, but every single eye in the studio was now locked on the stage, riveted by what they were witnessing. This wasn't going according to anyone's script. This was live television at its most raw and unpredictable. Joy froze for just a moment, the kind of pause that can't be rehearsed or hidden, the kind that reveals genuine emotion breaking through professional training. The camera captured everything, the flash of frustration crossing her face, the tightening around her mouth, the flicker in her eyes when she realized with dawning horror that he'd taken control of the room away from her. 3 seconds of silence stretched like 3 hours. Kennedy didn't gloat, didn't press his advantage with unnecessary cruelty. He simply settled back in his chair, hands folded comfortably, the absolute picture of composure and control. In the control room, producers were undoubtedly panicking, frantically discussing whether to cut to commercial, whether to intervene somehow, whether to let this continue. But in the studio itself, only one thing mattered to the audience, to the cameras, to everyone watching. The balance of power had shifted completely. Joy Behar, the undisputed queen of quick comebacks and cutting remarks, had just been outmaneuvered on her own show, and everyone present knew it. Joy straightened in her chair, desperately trying to reclaim some authority, some control over a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond her grasp. Her voice turned sharper, dripping with sarcasm that barely concealed the mounting irritation underneath. "So now you're positioning yourself as some kind of savior of truth?" she said, shaking her head with an exaggerated, mocking smile. "Please. You twist words more skillfully than most people twist outright lies. You're a performer, Senator, not a statesman." The audience released a collective "ooh," sensing another verbal swing incoming, another moment of potential impact. Kennedy didn't flinch. He met her gaze directly, steadily, and the corners of his mouth lifted just slightly, too calm, too confident, too completely unbothered by her escalating hostility. "That's fascinating," he said, his tone smooth but cold enough to cut through the studio's atmosphere like a knife through warm butter. "I was under the impression that twisting words was this network's primary job description. But I appreciate you confirming my suspicions so publicly." The studio erupted. Gasps mixed with laughter, shock blending with appreciation for the precision of the counterstrike. Even Whoopi Goldberg glanced up from her cue cards, eyebrows raised in an expression that suggested she couldn't quite decide whether to intervene or simply let this chaos play out to its inevitable conclusion. Joy blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard again, then forced out a chuckle that didn't quite reach her eyes or sound entirely authentic. She leaned closer to Kennedy, lowering her voice but sharpening it to a razor's edge. "This isn't your Senate hearing, Senator," she snapped, her frustration now barely contained. "You can't just filibuster your way out of facing actual facts. You can't hide behind clever wordplay when the substance is absent." Kennedy leaned in as well, not aggressively, not threateningly, just steadily, like a man who didn't need volume to be heard, who understood that true power whispers rather than shouts. "No need to filibuster, Miss Behar," he said, his voice even, almost quiet, but somehow carrying enough weight to silence the entire room. Facts have this remarkable habit of standing upright, all by themselves, while opinions, particularly opinions like yours, have a tendency to fall over the moment the applause dies down. The audience reacted instantly and powerfully. Applause, gasps, a few people literally rising from their seats in appreciation of what they'd just witnessed. Some sat frozen, genuinely unsure whether they were watching a debate or witnessing something closer to a public execution. Joy's practiced smile vanished entirely. She opened her mouth to fire back, but the words stalled somewhere between her brain and her tongue, trapped in the space between anger and genuine disbelief at what was happening to her. Kennedy didn't press further. He didn't need to. He simply leaned back, folded his hands with deliberate calm, eyes steady and patient, letting the silence complete the work his words had already accomplished. The crowd felt the shift viscerally. This wasn't an interview anymore. This wasn't even really a debate. This was a systematic dismantling, conducted one carefully measured sentence at a time, by a man who'd clearly been preparing for this moment his entire career. Joy's smile had vanished completely by this point. What had begun as playful sparring in her mind had transformed into a tug-of-war she was losing badly. Her voice sharpened further, frustration seeping through every syllable like water through cracks in a dam. "You talk slowly because you think it makes you sound wise," she snapped, her hands gesturing with increasing agitation. "It doesn't. It just makes you sound old. It makes you sound like you're performing some character, rather than actually engaging with substance." The crowd murmured uncomfortably. Some laughed nervously, others exchanged significant glances. It was the kind of personal attack that crosses unspoken lines, and everyone in the studio felt it that moment when criticism becomes cruelty, when debate becomes something uglier. Kennedy didn't move initially. He simply looked at her with that same unshakable calm, like a man patiently waiting for an echo to die before speaking, like someone who understands that silence often communicates more than words. Then he leaned closer to his microphone, his tone dropping lower but somehow becoming firmer, more authoritative, his Louisiana drawl carrying the weight of every quiet room he'd ever commanded, every courtroom he'd dominated, every opponent he'd intellectually dismantled. "Down where I come from, Miss Behar," he said slowly, each word landing with the precision of a hammer wrapped in velvet. "We talk slowly so that lies don't have time to slip out accidentally. We measure our words because we actually mean them. You might consider trying that approach sometime." The audience exploded. Applause, whistles, even a few cheers echoed through the studio like thunder rolling through a canyon. The sound was overwhelming, organic, impossible to manufacture or control. Joy's face flushed visibly red. She forced a tight smile back into place, but the tension around her eyes, the way her jaw clenched, the slight tremor in her hands, all of it betrayed her. The camera captured every detail, the kind of genuine emotional reaction that no amount of media training can fully conceal. Sarah Haynes tried desperately to cut in, her voice tentative and uncertain. "All right, let's try to keep things civil here, folks." But Kennedy wasn't finished. His tone remained calm, even kind in its way, but the words themselves hit with more force than any shout could have managed. "I didn't come here to sound intelligent, Miss Behar," he said, looking from Joy to the camera, addressing the millions watching at home rather than just the woman beside him. "I came here to sound real, to speak truth plainly. But I suppose that's offensive in a world that's become addicted to pretending, to performing, to saying whatever keeps the applause coming regardless of whether it's actually true." The applause returned, louder this time, longer, echoing with the sound of shifting allegiances, of an audience choosing sides in real time. Joy's practiced composure cracked visibly. The studio lights seemed harsher somehow, the air thicker, the space more confining. Kennedy didn't celebrate, didn't gloat, didn't make any performative gesture of victory. He simply settled back in his chair once more, the absolute picture of composure, while Joy Behar, the woman who had controlled this space for years, who had dominated countless interviews, suddenly looked like the one under interrogation. Joy could feel everything slipping away, Every attempted comeback had backfired. Every clever remark had been turned against her. Every moment of confident attack had resulted in devastating counterattack. The control she'd exercised at the beginning of this interview had evaporated completely. She straightened her back, summoning that familiar fire, desperate but still defiant, unwilling to surrender even as the battle was clearly lost. "You think being blunt makes you brave?" she said, forcing out a laugh that landed awkwardly in the tense studio atmosphere. "It doesn't. It just makes you reckless. It makes you someone who says whatever gets applause without considering consequences." The audience stirred, sensing this was her final swing, her last desperate attempt to land a meaningful blow. Kennedy didn't rush his reply. Instead, he rose slightly from his chair, not standing fully, not making some dramatic gesture, just shifting his posture to tall and commanding. And crucially, he turned his attention away from Joy entirely, fixing his eyes on the camera, on the millions watching at home, as if the woman beside him had become irrelevant to the conversation. "Reckless," he said evenly, his voice carrying perfect clarity, "is pretending you're brave while hiding behind prepared questions and controlled environments. Reckless is attacking people while protected by your platform and your audience. I speak my truth without teleprompters, without safety nets, without the comfort of knowing everyone around me agrees. That's not reckless, Miss Behar. That's just honest." The crowd erupted whistles, thunderous applause, a few shouts of, "That's it! And tell her!" echoing through the studio. Even Whoopi raised her eyebrows significantly, her hand partially covering what looked suspiciously like a grin she was trying to suppress. Joy blinked, visibly stunned for a moment, then forced herself to recover some composure. "You're just performing honesty," she shot back, her voice tighter now, almost pleading for some foothold in this conversation she'd completely lost control of. "It's an act, just like everything else you do." The laughter in the room died down just enough for Kennedy's reply to land with crystal clarity. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, would never need to. "No, ma'am," he said softly but with absolute certainty, steady as a heartbeat, calm as deep water. "I'm just not afraid to sound wrong in a world that's become obsessed with sounding right. I'd rather be honestly imperfect than perfectly dishonest." The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that makes an entire room forget to breathe, that suspends time, that transforms a moment into something people will remember for years. Joy's lips parted as if to respond, but no words emerged. Her mouth moved soundlessly for a second before closing again. Kennedy held her gaze for one beat longer, then looked back toward the crowd, his expression unreadable but his presence absolutely overwhelming. It wasn't just a comeback. It wasn't merely winning an argument. This was checkmate complete, total, undeniable, and every single person in that room knew it. Joy sat frozen in her chair, the tension in the studio so suffocating it felt like the oxygen itself had been removed from the space. The applause lights mounted around the room weren't needed anymore. The crowd was alive entirely on its own, reacting authentically to what they were witnessing. Every eye was locked on Joy, waiting to see if she'd attempt another swing or finally admit defeat. Her smile twitched at the corners, that television-trained expression that had carried her through 1,000 difficult interviews. But now it looked brittle, almost painful to maintain, like a mask that no longer quite fit her face. The cue cards in her hands trembled slightly, her fingers digging into them until the paper creased and bent. She forced herself to take a breath, tried to speak, but nothing came out initially. It wasn't that she lacked words. Joy Behar had never lacked for words. It was that none of them would sound strong enough now, convincing enough, powerful enough to matter. Kennedy didn't move right away. He didn't have to. The silence was accomplishing more than any additional words could. When he finally leaned forward slightly, his voice dropped to that calm, measured tone that had turned every one of Joy's insults into ammunition against her. "You called me a joke at the start of this conversation," he said, his drawl slow and deliberate, each word precisely placed. "But you see, a joke is only funny until it starts telling the truth. And the truth, Miss Behar, is something you stopped being interested in a long time ago." The line cut through the room like lightning through a dark sky. Gasps erupted, then a wave of sound built rapidly, the audience rising to their feet, clapping, shouting, the kind of genuine chaos that cameras struggle to contain. Someone in the back yelled, "Say it again!" and laughter broke through like thunder following that lightning. Joy blinked rapidly, still forcing that smile, but her eyes told an entirely different story, cornered, shaken, completely exposed. Kennedy waited patiently for the noise to settle, not rushing, not gloating, not making any performative gesture of victory. When the studio finally quieted enough for him to be heard, he didn't smirk or move to claim his triumph visibly. He simply turned his head toward Joy, steady and unflinching. "In this room today, Miss Behar," he said quietly but with devastating clarity, "I didn't out-talk you. You simply ran out of things you actually believe." The studio went completely still. The sound engineer forgot to adjust his levels. In the control room, producers stared at their monitors in stunned silence, every one of them realizing they were watching television history unfold in real time, watching something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The camera zoomed in tight on Joy's face, capturing everything, her smile gone now, her jaw tense, her eyes glistening slightly under the harsh studio lights. For a long, stretched-out second, neither of them spoke. Kennedy's expression remained unchanged, composed, grounded, the face of a man who had come prepared to fight with truth instead of volume. Joy's hands trembled as she set her cue cards down on the table, her gaze dropping before pride forced it back up. But when she met his eyes again, there was no power left to project, no authority remaining to claim. The audience, still on their feet, began to chant softly at first. Then with growing volume, "Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy." The sound built into something raw and electric, something organic and real that no producer could have orchestrated. The red studio light blinked, signaling the segment's scheduled end, but no one moved to cut away. The moment was too significant, too unprecedented to interrupt. Kennedy broke the silence with a quiet breath, leaning forward one final time. "The thing about truth, ma'am," he said, just loud enough for the microphone to catch every word, "is that it doesn't need applause to validate it. It doesn't need your approval or anyone else's. It just needs the courage to be spoken aloud." He leaned back slowly, deliberately, folding his hands on the table in front of him with absolute finality. The crowd roared again, not just clapping now, they were standing, shouting, filming on their phones, cheering with genuine enthusiasm. Joy remained seated, her face frozen in that strange mixture of disbelief and forced grace, her mind undoubtedly racing for some way out, some closing line that could salvage something from this disaster. But the moment had already chosen its winner, had already written its own ending. The camera captured everything. Kennedy, still calm and composed under the heat of the lights. Joy, silent in her own spotlight for perhaps the first time in her career. This was more than a debate that had gone wrong. This was a complete dismantling, a televised reckoning that would be studied and discussed for years. And when the director finally whispered into headsets, "Cut to commercial," the instruction barely registered because the story had already written itself in a way that no editor could improve. The red light above the camera stayed illuminated longer than it should have, as if no one in the control room wanted to be the person responsible for ending this moment. Joy sat motionless, staring down at her notes, flipping through blank cue cards as if searching desperately for some line that could save her, some comeback that could restore what had been lost. Her lips parted once pure instinct, the automatic response of someone trained to close every segment with a witty remark. But no words emerged. The tension was too thick, the silence too heavy, the defeat too complete. The queen of sharp commentary had finally, definitively run out of script. Whoopi glanced around the table at her co-hosts, then cleared her throat, stepping into the void with the practiced authority of someone who'd saved many difficult moments. "All right," she said with that dry, knowing tone that could reset any room. "I think we're going to wrap it right there." The audience laughed softly at first, like collective exhale after holding breath too long, like relief valve releasing pressure from an overloaded system. Kennedy looked up calmly, gave Whoopi a polite, respectful nod, then turned toward the crowd. He didn't stand dramatically, didn't wave his arms like a man celebrating victory, didn't make any gesture suggesting he believed he'd won something. Instead, he leaned toward the microphone one last time and spoke in that same calm, steady voice that had carried him through the entire storm. "This was never about taking sides," he said, his tone sincere, quiet enough that people instinctively leaned forward to hear better. It was simply about saying what you mean and meaning what you say, even when it cost you the applause. Especially when it cost you the applause. The words hung in the air for several beats before the audience reacted. No whooping this time, no chaos, just the kind of applause that starts small and grows heavier with meaning and understanding. It wasn't noise for its own sake, it was acknowledgement, respect, recognition of something genuine in a world of performance. Even Joy, still sitting rigid in her chair, lifted her head just enough to look at him. Her expression remained unreadable, but her silence communicated what pride wouldn't allow her to say with words. When the cameras finally cut away, Kennedy stood, shook a few hands with genuine warmth, and walked toward the exit without fanfare. The applause followed him softer now, more human than performative, more real than rehearsed. No music played as he left. No producers rushed to intercept him. Just the sound of real applause, honest and sustained, accompanying him as he made his way off the stage. He didn't smile for the cameras on his way out, didn't pause for any dramatic final moment. He simply nodded once to the audience, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement before disappearing behind the curtain. Within minutes, the clip hit the internet with explosive force. Edited, shared, replayed, dissected from every possible angle. The caption that spread faster than any headline could have predicted. Joy Behar tried to roast Senator Kennedy. He turned the fire into light. Millions watched, rewatched, shared again not just for the clash itself but for what followed. For the quiet that descended after the noise stopped. For the moment when one man's composed calm transformed into undeniable power. For the demonstration that dignity and truth could defeat volume and performance. And in that silence, in those final moments, Kennedy hadn't looked like a politician playing games or a performer delivering lines. He'd looked like something increasingly rare in modern media, a person who genuinely meant every single word he said, and possessed the courage to say them regardless of consequence. As the screen faded to black and the studio began clearing, one truth remained abundantly clear to everyone who'd witnessed what transpired. They hadn't just watched an interview go wrong. They'd watched a masterclass in integrity, delivered by someone who understood that real power doesn't announce itself, it simply exists, undeniable and unshakable, requiring no applause to validate its truth. And Joy Behar? She'd learned an expensive lesson about the difference between confidence and competence, between performance and substance, between talking loud and speaking truth. A lesson delivered with devastating precision by a man she'd underestimated, broadcast live to millions, captured forever in the unforgiving permanence of the digital age.